Good morning and welcome to the 10th episode of our Future Forward series. We'll be getting started shortly. So if you're in the waiting room, just go ahead and go to Slido, spelled SLIDO.com, and type in code forward, the number 10, and you can get started. That way we're going to be using that platform to answer any questions. But we'll be getting started shortly. Thank you for tuning in.
COVID-19 has been a catalyst for ideas, for innovation.
Our employers have to be flexible.
How do we build wealth at the individual level in communities that did not have that previously?
Every city in the world will need to get more sustainable.
Innovators, entrepreneurs aren't just born, they're cultivated.
Building fair and inclusive economies is a complicated process, and we will need to be vigilant as we move forward.
Good morning. My name is Elise Laurel, Program Manager for the Western Riverside Council of Governments, known as WRCOG, and we are on our 10th episode for the series, so welcome back. Now, for any viewers that are new out there, here at WRCOG, we serve as a regional agency that focuses on helping many of our cities and jurisdictions in the Western Riverside County subregion in the areas of transportation, planning, energy, environment, and conservation, just to name a few. And today's focus will actually be on what we likely haven't been doing much of during the pandemic, and that is on transit and transportation. Now, before we jump into the episode, I want to thank our in-kind sponsor, the Inland Empire Regional Chamber of Commerce, for continuing to support our event. And as a friendly reminder, we will also be taking questions at the very end of the presentation, and you can go ahead and get started by scanning the QR code that appears in the corner of the screen and type in the event code forward, spelled FORWARD, WARD and the number 10, forward 10, and you can submit your questions that way, or you can wait till the very, very end. I'll give a reminder on the event code in the future. And then also in addition, there should be a code that's popping up in the corner of the screen. Additionally, because this is a YouTube link, you have the luxury of pausing and going back if you feel like you missed any information. And also, please be sure to subscribe right down below and hit that like button. So as I mentioned, today's focus will be on a topic, something many of us have likely not been doing during the pandemic, and that is on transit and transportation. And today we will be learning the latest trends and behaviors that have been influenced by the pandemic, such as is working from home here to stay, remote experience versus in-person experience, impacts on shared travel modes, and so much more. So with that, I'm happy to kick it off to our transportation expert over at WRCOG, and also our Deputy Executive Director for the agency, Mr. Christopher Gray. So Chris, take it away.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Gray, the Deputy Director for the Western Riverside Council of Governments. I'm here today to talk about the future of transportation. So today we'll be talking about 6 specific topics. 1, we'll be sharing with you some data on how COVID-19 has impacted travel behavior. 2, we'll talk about if working from home is here to stay. 3, we'll talk a little bit more about the personal experience for remote experience. 4, we're going to talk about the future of personal travel. 5, we'll be talking about how COVID has impacted shared travel modes. And 6, we'll be sharing 10 land use and transportation trends to watch for. Obviously, COVID-19 has had a significant impact on our society at all levels, but particularly in terms of travel. When benchmarked against spring 2020, we have seen some very significant decreases in personal travel. Within Riverside County, in April, there was a 70% drop in vehicle miles traveled, which is a measure of overall activity. In June, that has, by June of 2020, the decrease was 25%. And we are seeing today levels of congestion that approach pre-COVID levels. One thing when we benchmark Riverside County against other regions is we've noticed that the drop-off in VMT is far less than it has been in more urbanized areas, for example, Orange and LA County. And it appears that one of the relationships is it has a lot to do with the types of jobs. So areas, for example, in LA and Orange County that have a number of professional jobs and office jobs, people are able to work from home more. And in fact, less than 30% of all Riverside County households have at least one adult who's able to telework. As a comparison, in LA County, on average, it's over 40%, and in certain parts of LA and Orange County, the majority of the residents are working in areas where fields where they can telework. So what's happening now? Well, obviously, even with the current improvements in the COVID-19 situation, many activities are still occurring remotely. Workers who can work remotely are doing so, though we are seeing a shift of people to work from remote work to working in an office, at least on a part-time basis. There are some offices and professional jobs where they have reopened. This appears to be, and one would think that this has led to a decrease in personal travel, when actually it has not. Overall, we have seen significant increases in travel for shopping and deliveries. And in fact, many areas have seen levels of delivery traffic and truck traffic that are higher than pre-pandemic levels. It would appear to be that there is still congestion. So anyone who's driven during a peak hour on a Monday through Thursday has been stuck in traffic. So clearly the congestion is there, though the duration seems to be less. And what we have found is that when we have looked at people's total travel, some folks are actually traveling more. They're just traveling for different reasons. So here's an example. Perhaps, and this may be something that applies to you personally, maybe you're not going into the office 5 days a week as you typically did. However, we see people making more trips to the grocery store, more grocery trips. It appears, for example, that sometimes, for example, when you might hear, hey, Costco's having a sale on Clorox wipes, everyone rushes to Costco. That seems to be happening more and more. We also have noticed that people are making trips deliberately to get out of the house. So there's a higher number of recreational trips. And so overall, we see people driving the same amount, just for different purposes or different times. So one of the questions that a lot of folks have asked is working from home here to stay? Are we going to need offices in the future? And we touched on this in a previous Future Forward. I would say, however, it's very unlikely we'll see a complete abandonment of the offices. And the reason is that offices offer an opportunity for collaboration and encourage creativity. Some offices have to stay open and have stayed open. So for example, many of our members, their offices have been open to the public at least at some limited level. There's a need for people to come to government offices to drop off materials, sign papers, drop off payments and the like. So what we see happening is a future where people will be working from home on a part-time basis, but not completely leaving the office if possible. So for example, a schedule might be Monday, Wednesday, a person's working in the office. Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, they're working at home or they're coming into the office for meetings. But a complete work at home scenario is not likely for many people, and a complete abandonment of the office is highly unlikely for a number of reasons. But why this is important is that if you only have to go into your office 2 or 3 days a week, that has a very significant ramification on where people choose to live. What I also want to talk about is how is the remote experience versus the in-person experience? So COVID has forced us or allowed us to do a number of things remotely, which we otherwise have not done before. For example, there's been a very significant expansion of remote schooling, and I would argue that this expansion of remote schooling is likely to be permanent. As an example, my 13-year-old daughter now does all of her schooling from 8 in the morning till noon up in our loft. She sits in front of her computer with her headphones on and does Zooms for 4 hours a day. Before then, she had never done any kind of remote schooling at all. I believe that remote healthcare for routine matters is likely to continue. Again, to use my daughter as an example, she's a 13-year-old young lady. She happens to have an acne problem. Rather than me taking the time to take off from work, to pick her up from school, to drive to the doctor's office, to sit in a waiting room for half an hour if I'm lucky, sign a bunch of routine paperwork, wait more, pay, go see the doctor for 15 minutes, have the doctor hand us a prescription, have me drive that prescription to a pharmacy, have me then pick up the prescription, give it to my daughter. Instead, we did a telemedicine visit, which is becoming routine. I sent pictures of my daughter's acne. The doctor looked at it and says, yep, she's 13, she has an acne problem. Sorry to make her, hope I'm not embarrassing her. She's probably not watching this anyways. Sent a prescription into the pharmacy. I was done in about 20 minutes from start to finish. So for routine health matters, telemedicine is clearly here to stay. The use of delivery services for food and groceries, there are many people who have not been to a grocery store since COVID started. There is the ability now to have nearly everything you need brought to you. And this really amplified a trend that had already happened. So as many of you know and are aware, Amazon has become increasingly a much larger part of our lives. Now with Grubhub, Postmates, and others, there are opportunities to literally get anything you need. My wife, for example, has been using Instacart for the past year. And unless she forgets something, or I forget to tell her that I'd like something, when she makes me go to the store and get it, we don't even need to go to the grocery store. And I would also add that some of the in-person entertainment is likely to transition. So for example, I think it's a legitimate question on whether movie theaters survive in their current form. As many of you might be aware, streaming services such as HBO Max will be offering first-run movies that normally would have gone to the theaters first. Whether that trend continues or not, I think it's likely it will continue in some level. However, we should be mindful that the in-person experience is not going to go away. Even though you can have meals delivered to your home and you can have groceries delivered to your home, people still want to eat out. And during the pandemic, it's provided an opportunity for restaurants to offer outside dining, maintain the same restaurant experience, just in a slightly different way. People continue to want to go out to drink. They continue to want to go out to bars, social gatherings. In particular, we've seen a very significant demand for active recreations and sports. There is a strong desire, as I said, for people to get out of their house. And with the relaxation of some of the COVID restrictions, we've seen in-person sports come back. It's likely in the near term, we'll see the county relaxing requirements on gyms and other types of recreational activities. And we shouldn't forget that some medical services still have to be done in person. If you've had a COVID test or you've been vaccinated, you've had to go somewhere. You still have to go to the pharmacy. In many cases, if you're ill or injured, telemedicine doesn't work. If you have a broken arm, telemedicine's not going to fix that for you. So what I'm here today is to talk about really where we see the future going. And we're going to be talking about some potential scenarios and some possible scenarios and the most likely outcomes. So on the personal travel level, it's likely we'll see more driving. We'll see people driving throughout the day. We'll see people being most comfortable when they're driving by themselves or family members. Possibly people driving longer distances. And then we also see self-driving technology making it easier for people to drive longer distances and drive more. It's also possible that people may no longer trust shared travel modes like carpooling, car sharing, and transit. I will share with you, I have a neighbor who caught COVID from his carpooling friend. He's not likely to carpool anymore. And so instead of carpooling, he now drives himself. When we look at the research that's been done on self-driving cars, a lot of it's been focused on safety, acceptance, policies, but there hasn't been a lot of research done on the likelihood that people will drive more. The fact of the matter is, if you have a car that can drive itself a portion of the time or a significant amount of the time, it's far less onerous to drive than if you are outside, if you're in a traditional car. And some of the forecasts that we've seen suggest that the deployment of self-driving and autonomous cars, or at least partially self-driving and autonomous cars, can increase the amount of driving at a very significant level. And so when we talk about self-driving cars, one of the questions is, well, that's just going to happen 20 years in the future, or that's only going to happen for, people who drive luxury cars, when in fact that's not true. So my personal vehicle is a humble 2019 Kia Sorento. It is a mid-range SUV. It's not a Lexus. It's not a BMW. After all, I work at WRCOG, keep in mind. But it has a number of autonomous vehicle features that come standard. It has smart cruise control. So driving back from Palm Springs, I was able to set the cruise control and the car drove itself. I had to keep my hands on the steering wheel. Well, I was supposed to keep my hands on the steering wheel, and the smart cruise control would cause the car to accelerate or decelerate based on the other cars around it. I also have lane departure warnings. So when I had my hand on the steering wheel and I might have drifted or started to drift out of lane, the car would tell me. I also have a blind spot detector. These are routine things. So when I need to make a lane change, it will tell me if there's another car there. I recently had an instance where the collision warning came into effect, and the collision warning caused my car to brake automatically when another car got too close to me. There's also brake assists, there's also backup warnings, and these are all standard features. So again, this is not a luxury car. This is a $35,000 SUV. It is a mid-level SUV, and this is a car that anyone can buy, and it has many of the features that an autonomous car already has. So what does the future hold? We're going to be very quickly in a situation where cars are able to drive themselves for an extended period of time. Maybe not 100% of the time, but a big portion of the time. And if you're driving in traffic or you're driving routine pathways, the car will pretty much drive itself, and many of the cars on the road can already do that. Will you still need a driver? Yes. Legally, liability purposes, for any other reasons, drivers will still be there and people will still be in the typical driving position. But what it means is driving is less strenuous, driving is less onerous, and driving is less difficult. And this, in and of itself, could lead to more driving. One of the impacts we've noted in terms of shared uses is one of the modes that's been very significantly impacted by COVID is transit. So transit has lost about 70% of their ridership transit lost 70% of its ridership during the initial period. Some of that ridership has been recovered. However, the public transit systems have taken huge financial impacts because of the pandemic. This will force transit agencies to rethink their operating methods and approaches to stay relevant. While some of this financial impact will be mitigated by outside aid from the federal and state government, going forward, transit's going to find it very difficult to fund their operations at their current level without some kind of adjustment. So not only has transit been impacted by COVID, but also mobility services. Similar to transit, Uber and Lyft and other similar types of transportation services lost about 70% of their ridership when COVID hit. Some of it has come back. But what we are finding is that many people are just not willing to share a vehicle with a stranger if they have any choice. Additionally, mobility services, as often is the case, are heavily used as part of travel. So for example, it was when I would personally travel somewhere, let's say I'm flying into Sacramento for work, going to a meeting with the legislature or going to a meeting with the state government, I would fly into Sacramento, and instead of renting a car, I would take an Uber from the airport to my hotel, get up the next morning, take an Uber from there to where I needed to go, take an Uber back. So I might take four to six Uber trips while I'm there in lieu of renting a car. Well, if I'm not making that trip, then I'm not using Uber. And so what we've seen is some of the heaviest impacts to these mobility services have been because leisure and business travel has decreased significantly. As that comes back, we would expect demand for mobility services to come back as well. However, there is likely to be a group of people who are not willing to share rides anymore and may go back to renting cars or finding other means to travel. What I would say as a cautionary note, though, is it's still a little too early to tell how much these behavioral changes are permanent and how much is temporary. We often move in cycles where something happens, we react, we overcorrect, we then go back to slightly business as usual, but maybe there's a change, something else happens, we react, we realize we've overcorrected, and the cycle continues. It's not likely we'll ever go back to life as it was before COVID. However, how much these changes will occur, it's still a little bit too early to tell. And so here's the part of the example of the presentation where I talk about the Great Manure Crisis of 1894. And yes, this is really a thing. And so back in the 1880s and the 1890s, as cities started to urbanize, one of the primary modes of transportation was the horse. The horse was a mode of personal transportation, so you're able to ride a horse where you wanted to go. Else you were walking or taking some kind of an electric streetcar or some other kind of public transportation. Horse-drawn carriages were a way, similar to our taxis and Ubers of today, how you were able to travel around. And more importantly, horse-drawn wagons were really the only way that you could move goods in and out of cities and towns. So as cities grew in population, the number of horses grew as well. And it led to a quote from the Times of London, which extrapolated out that said, in 50 years, every street in London will be buried under 9 feet of manure. And it got to the point where there was a international conference that was called to discuss this issue and had to be canceled because of the various health impacts from the horse manure and the dead horses in New York City, hence which is why this is the Great Manure Crisis of 1894. Well, clearly what happened is this problem was solved because our cities are not knee-deep in yards and yards of horse waste and dead horses by the car. So there was a change in technology, technology came along, and technology changed the issue. So because of that, I would offer this cautionary note that we don't always do a great job of predicting the future. And the farther you go out, the less certainty you have. So because of that, I'm going to share with you an idea called the cone of uncertainty. The way the cone of uncertainty works is we first create uppers and lower bounds on a particular topic. The upper and lower bounds are the limits of what we think feasibly could happen. And then the upper or lower bounds set the range of possibilities. So for example, if we apply this in real terms, let's look at the question, what percentage of people will be working at home over the next 20 years? Right now, we can estimate that number is very close to what's already occurring today. Within Riverside County, that's about 30% of the people working at home. 5 years from now, that number may go up or down, but it's not going to be 0 and it's not going to be 100. And over time, as technology changes, behavior changes, that sets the upper and lower bound. But this idea gives us a framework for, as we talk about these trends and this all the things that could happen in the future, it gives us a framework to address them in a consistent fashion. So what I'm going to talk about now are 10 trends I'm watching that myself and the other staff members at WRCOG, as well as other people in my profession, are watching to tell us what the future will be. I'm not going to tell you what the future will be. I'm going to tell you the trends, and I'm going to tell you some of the key indicators that we should be watching for. So clearly, as I said, as we just said in this example, is number one trend is working at home. It is likely that some work from home will be allowed for many jobs. However, 100% working from home is not feasible. Only about 50% of the jobs can theoretically be done remotely. So what that will likely lead to is partial working at home, and that will reduce some overall travel. And we likely will see some level of congestion during the peak hours, but it won't last as long. But as I said, there is some uncertainty on working from home. And what to watch for is announcements from companies either saying they're allowed to work from home or requiring them to return to the office. So for example, some of the technology companies, I believe Twitter and Netflix, have announced that their employees are allowed to work remotely permanently. Other companies have talked about returning their employees. And we know that within the public sector, within Riverside County, a number of the large agencies we work with, for example, Riverside County, is going to require or has already required some of their employees to return to work. Here at WRCOG, we're still evaluating the situation, but I will say eventually WRCOG employees will return to the office. Will it be on a part-time basis? Yes. Will it be 5 days a week, 8 hours a day? Likely no. But I would watch for other announcements from other companies throughout the region and nationally to see how this is working out. Another trend is living where you want to. So clearly, if you don't have to work in the office 5 days a week, you can rethink where you live. There's anecdotal evidence that people are leaving the higher cost and denser areas for lower cost and less dense regions. I would point out only 3 out of the 10 largest California counties gained population in 2020, and they were Riverside, Fresno, and Sacramento. And so here's how I think this might work. Let's say you have a job working at a technology company in the Irvine Business Center. You currently live in an apartment in Irvine. Maybe you're 10 minutes away from your work. You're living in an apartment with your family, and you're choosing to live there to lessen the commute. That's if you have to go into the office 5 days a week. If you have to go into the office 1 or 2 days a week, maybe you don't have to live there anymore. Maybe you can live in Riverside County. Maybe having to work at home with your family has led you to want to have a larger area. I happen to live in a single family house in unincorporated Riverside County, south of Corona. My house is large enough that my wife, my daughter, and I are able to all work at home or do in-home schooling as she does and never see each other. We actually only see each other before we go to work. We see each other at lunch, and then we all see each other for dinner. Other than meeting up in the kitchen, we never have any conflict. We never have any contact with each other. I think my family might prefer that, but that's for another day. So what I would be watching is the population gain in Riverside County and housing starts, rent prices, and home prices. So far, we can tell that there's a significant increase in demand for homes, single-family and multifamily homes in Riverside County because of the building permits we track through the TUMP program. Whether that continues or not, or the way in which that continues, is definitely something that we'll be watching. A third trend is more walking and biking. Even during the most restrictive elements of the pandemic, people were always able to go outside and walk and bike. It's a way to exercise without going to the gym. If you like your family and they're willing to go on walks and bike rides with you, it is a way to spend some time with your family in the outdoors. And we believe that people are going to prioritize areas that have good access to outdoor recreation opportunities. So one of the trends I'll be watching is, are people going to want to be outdoors after the gyms reopen? Are people, for example, going to continue walking and biking as they have over the pandemic period? Will we see, for example, more interest in outdoor recreation, more camping, more people purchasing RVs, more people purchasing boats? But regardless of which, outdoor recreation is likely here to stay, and people are going to want to have more opportunities to walk and bike in a safe manner. Something that's already happening is more deliveries and online shopping. The only question is, what's the upper limit? People are comfortable, as I've said. Many people are ordering their groceries and ordering all their essential needs from delivery services. We see continued people ordering takeout, even when some of the COVID restrictions are relaxed. Some people just prefer to eat at home. The question is, in the end, where does it stop? Will people want to never eat out again or never shop in person? Absolutely not. There are certain things you just cannot buy online, or more difficult to buy online, or people prefer not to buy online. However, there will be more delivery and logistics travel. People are already purchasing many of the items, as I said, they needed. And one possible effect is we could see a demand for logistics facilities in urban areas. So what I would watch for is, how does online shopping continue to grow? Is there an upper limit? Is there a percentage of transactions that people just won't make online? And so this is something I will definitely be watching for. Another related trend is we're calling the changing face of retail. Clearly, there's less demand for brick and mortar retail. This was already happening pre-COVID. COVID just accelerated this to a significant amount. You may see retail centers that focus more on entertaining, eating, healthcare services. It's possible some of these retail centers could convert to other uses like residential or logistics. I, for example, saw an old Circuit City that was converted into a large daycare center. It was a large open space, and they're able to use partitions and indoor playground equipment and other means to create an indoor daycare center. This is something that is definitely impactful for the cities because less sales tax, less revenue for the cities. So what I would watch for are instances in which older retail centers are being converted to other uses, and to watch that conversion happening. I would also add that there is a strong movement underway in the state legislature to facilitate these retail conversions, especially for older centers. So I believe this is something that will definitely happen. The question is, how much is it going to happen? Another trend I would talk about is, I call it more driving, less stress. If we have partial remote working, which is the most likely scenario, it's still going to require some driving. However, I believe that workers will have the flexibility of the days and hours they can commute, so they can then time their commute to be able to travel during less congested times. And as we see more automation technology in the cars, it'll make driving less stressful. And then you may see workers who are willing to drive longer distances because travel is less onerous. And so what I would be watching for is future roadway congestion. We are already seeing roadway congestion come back to pre-COVID levels. The question is not only how bad does the congestion get, but how long does it extend? I think another thing we'll be watching for as a transportation planner at the regional level is how many people are using transit. So some riders have returned to transit, others have not. And in fact, I've seen some surveys where people have said they will never ride transit again. We don't know if these are short-term and long-term trends. We don't know if this will be the same between bus and rail. However, regardless of what the actual number is, transit will need to look at futures where they have reduced ridership, reduced revenue, and therefore I'll be watching how transit agencies, what their ridership, what their service levels are, and what adjustments they make. Another trend I'm interested in is the shared ride services. So it'll be interesting to me whether people are still willing to share rides, whether people are still willing to get into an Uber. I believe that we will not see a significant use of shared ride modes until personal and business travel returns. This may be 2 to 3 years out. It may be a little bit more. It may be a little bit less. But what I would be watching for is how companies like Uber and Lyft are growing or contracting. Uber and Lyft made a significant financial investment in a recent ballot proposition, which would have forced their contractors to become employees. With the outcome of that ballot proposition, we believe that they'll be continuing to offer services within the region. However, it'll be one of the questions I'll be looking at is, are they continuing to grow or will they contract? There is clearly a pent-up demand for social activities, and a reduction in shopping and work trips could actually be offset by more travel for other reasons. I would point out that Riverside County's climate is truly ideal for outdoor dining and recreation. We get a very small amount of precipitation during the year, and with the exception of some excessive heat, I believe that there's a significant amount of opportunities for outdoor dining and recreation within Riverside County. And what I would be watching for is how retail centers reposition themselves to have more outdoor dining and outdoor recreational opportunities, even more than today. And then finally, I will be watching for a decentralization of the office. It's possible that companies might find it desirable or necessary to set up satellite offices, and for a variety of reasons. One is the office commute, but secondly, if you, let's say, were to have a large 250-person office, one of your employees becomes ill or becomes infected with COVID, there's the likelihood that they'll spread it to all the other employees. It's possible that companies will look to decentralize their office. And so what I will be watching for is, will we see companies not renewing office leases, downsizing their spaces? Are we going to see smaller offices come in? And I'll be curious to see what happens over the next 2 or 3 years about what happens in the office market. And so in summary, as I had said, COVID is fundamentally impacting our society. It is fundamentally changing our travel behavior. Some of these changes might be temporary, some might be permanent. As when I discussed the cone of uncertainty, we don't know the future with any degree of certainty, but we do know what some likely outcomes. And as I pointed out to you, there will be 10 trends that we're watching for. I'm sure there are others. So in the end, the main question is going to be is how much life goes back to the way it was before COVID. In certain respects, life may go back to exactly how it was before COVID. It's not likely on a number of these issues, but it's possible. But in the end, we know COVID will have some long-term effects in our society, and these 10 trends I've shared with you today will give you an insight into how those changes might occur. With that,
of the screen with your phone or your cell phone device, and then type in the event code forward and the number 10, and that is FORWARD and the number 10. Now I'll be turning it over to my colleague Rachel Singer, who will be moderating the Q&A section and portion of our episode with Chris Gray. So Rachel and Chris, turning it over to you.
Lisa. So as was mentioned, be sure to log into slido.com and type in the event code forward10 to submit questions and participate in the live polls. So I'd like to draw your attention to a current poll that we have going on right now, which we're looking for your input on. And the poll reads, are you comfortable riding public transit? A simple yes or no question, and we will circle back to hear the responses of what you all are comfortable with. So to start off the Q&A, Chris, I have a couple questions for you. First and foremost, our first question says, can you speak about the support for increasing bicycle infrastructure? There's been a bike boom due to COVID, and better bicycle infrastructure could facilitate more bicycle commuting, recreational bicycling, and even for errands. This could also help with traffic congestion and increasing health.
Yeah, Rachel, thank you. That's the great question. I wanted to say I absolutely believe that we have seen and will see more bicycle and pedestrian travel. I think the question really is what is the purpose of that travel? How is that travel occurring? Why is that travel occurring? And what I've seen a lot of is a lot more recreational trips. So for example, I have a 13-year-old daughter I mentioned previously, as many of you know. And oftentimes to get her out of the house and off her cell phone, I'll make her get on her bike or get on her scooter and bike around the neighborhood. And she's able to do that in a safe fashion. I've seen a number of folks on trails around my neighborhood and regional trails as well. So I think from a recreational perspective, there absolutely will be more bicycle and pedestrian travel, and we really should be investing in recreational trails. And I also think we should be mindful of getting people from their houses to regional trails in a safe fashion. So I've seen a number of instances where there are whole families walking and biking together. And it's a way to get exercise. It's a way to get out of the house. It's a way to bond as a family. So I see that as an absolute positive. What I'm a little unsure about is bicycling to work and the need for bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure in, for example, office areas or employment areas, because if we are going to see more work at home, and I think we absolutely are, people aren't going to necessarily need to commute to work. Or for example, if you have employment areas, for example, at downtown Riverside, you may not see the same density of office workers that you do now. So I would say absolutely we need to be investing in bicycle pedestrian infrastructure, period. People who, when they do walk and bike, should be able to do so in a safe fashion. But I think there's probably going to be a need and greater use of bicycle pedestrian facilities for recreational purposes and greater investment in allowing those folks to do that safely. And I think when we think about recreational users, we should be mindful that they're whole families. They're not necessarily experienced cyclists. There are families with younger children. Maybe they have dogs with them. I think my dog has probably gotten more walks than she has in her life over the past year. So I think it's also thinking about how we can design those facilities so they're safe for all users, safe for the elderly, safe for older people, younger people, pets, everything like that. So yes, absolutely there needs to be an investment, but I do suspect we'll see a lot more of the recreational travel than necessarily the work or commuting travel.
Yeah, and like you said, that active transportation integration kind of checks off a lot of boxes, if you will. It checks off the public health box, transportation box, the recreation box, open space, and so I think there's a lot of flexibility and opportunity there. So
yeah,
then,
and I think
go ahead.
I was going to say, people just want to get out of their house. I mean, if you're sitting in front of a computer for 8-10 hours a day, you just want to get out of your house. And one way you can do that simply, safely, is walking and biking. And if you think about the various COVID restrictions we've had, that's always something you could do. Like it never got to the point where you could never go for a walk. You can't ride your bike. Even during the darkest times of COVID and the most restrictive regulations we had in place, that was always allowed.
Yeah, definitely. So our next question is there support for more and better light rail in the region?
So I would say the question to that is yes, as long as those facilities are going to certain destinations and there's the travel to support it. I would say, for example, that light rail that went to major destinations such as maybe UCR, downtown Riverside, the Ontario airport, these major destinations are probably something I could see that potentially being viable. I would say in general, though, there's two factors we should consider and be cautious about. One is that technology is still incredibly expensive, and there's a number of rail projects that are occurring simultaneously, and there's a very small pot of money that a number of these projects. I believe at one time there were 50 plus streetcar projects nationally that were all competing for funding, and this was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and I was told maybe 1 or 2 of those projects would be funded.
Wow.
So it is incredibly competitive because you really can't build those projects with local funds. I will say though, one note of optimism on the funding side is I've seen some potential innovations. So for example, SVCTA, the San Bernardino County Transportation Agency, is looking at a possible partnership with Elon Musk to use some of his technology to improve connections to the Ontario Airport. What I would also say though is we should be mindful of the travel trends and the fact that if more people are working at home and people are prioritizing personal travel, I'm just not sure the ridership might be there, but I think that is more of a case-by-case basis. And I did want to point out that the city of Riverside is embarking on a study in partnership with a company called TIGM to look at a streetcar or some kind of a higher quality transit system within downtown Riverside. And I think if the right technology with the right origin and destinations could work. One thing I would just say in general about transit is we don't talk enough about the transportation, I call it user experience. And to take a little bit of a tangent, one of the reasons why Apple is so successful, if you think about your iPhone, is it has a great user experience. You open it up, you hit a button, you get your music, you buy your music from the iTunes store, it's downloaded to your phone automatically. You don't need to, I'm going to just pull up Spotify. It's all integrated. You don't have to really think about it. And Apple Store, for example, has great user experience. For those people who've ever been to a high-end retail establishment, if you think about the service you get versus a Walmart or a Target, it's completely different. And one of the reasons why high-end retail continues to do well is it provides a level of user experience. So think about the user experience of a personal vehicle versus a bus or light rail, and how different it is. So in a personal vehicle, you leave when you want, you're able to pick your route, you make whatever stops you need to on the way there, you're in a vehicle, that's safe, that's clean, you're able to regulate who goes in your vehicle. And because of that, the user experience for private automobiles is so high. And I think that's one of the reasons, frankly, why it's so hard to shift people to transit. So I think if a light rail project were to really think through the user experience and what the user experience is for user, that is one way to potentially attract the riders and make those projects viable.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, with our conversation about transit and everything, I wanted to bring our attention back to the poll. And let's see, let me pull it up really quick. Actually, we're going to go back to the Q&A. So the next question that I have from our audience reads, do you think that there will be a transition to in-person full-time work in the foreseeable future?
Transition to working at the office, yes. Transition to full-time, I would say probably not. I believe that the work at home genie has been left out of the bottle, has gotten out of the bottle. And I saw a recent survey that said 73% of all people want to continue working at home, at least on a part-time basis. And we at WRCOG are conducting a survey to determine how and when our employees are coming back to work, how we can do that in a safe fashion. But I would say that what seems to be missing from remote work, and I've been working at home for almost full-time for a year now, is as someone who manages the office and manages staff, is I just don't get that personal touch with people. So if someone's having a bad day, or they're having personal issues, or they're having problems with a coworker, if you're all in an office, that's readily apparent. You don't get those. You don't get that kind of personal touch. The training, the mentoring, we have brought people on. So for example, Elisa Laurel, who many of you know, I think she maybe was with us for 3 weeks before she started. We have employees I've never met in person at WRCOG. And the agency culture is something you need to maintain through frequent touches. And we do a lot of meetings. I can tell you, some people say we do too many, others would say we don't do enough. But even if you have regular Zooms, you have regular touches with people, you have regular discussions with people, it's just not the same as being in an office. And little things like, Did an invoice get processed? It's so much harder to do remotely. So I think there's two tensions here. I think there's going to be a desire by organizations to bring people back to the office. I think there's going to be a desire by employees to not come back to the office. And I think the happy medium is we're going to get to this hybrid. I would also say, as an agency, this remote working environment has actually made it a little bit easier for us to do meetings. And I would say that we are planning on doing all of our meetings. When we come back to the office and we start doing in-person meetings, we're going to offer a remote option. Some people may not feel comfortable leaving their house. Some people may want to work remotely. Some people may want to attend a meeting remotely. And so we had a recent experience at an admin and finance committee where someone came to give public testimony on an item. She wanted to speak in support of it. She lived in the Coachella Valley. So with the remote environment, she was able to log into the meeting, hear the presentation, offer her public comment, and log off. And it was maybe a 15-minute from start to finish. If we didn't offer the remote option, she would have had to drive to the office, which would have been 2 hours, sit there, wait for the item to be heard, speak again for a couple of minutes, and then drive back to her home. And that's a 5 or 6 hour. So it just makes certain things so much easier. I would just say this is going to vary significantly by industry, by type of employee, type of employers. Private sector employers are going to have a lot more flexibility. As government, we need to be open. People need to be able to come into the office. So for example, our TUMP program has transitioned to an online 100% fee payment system. People can pay all of their fees, yet sometimes people still want to drop checks off. So I had a developer call me and say, look, I've got $1 million check. I don't feel comfortable mailing it. Can I come drop it off? And I made arrangements for them to drop it off. So, and then Rachel, to kind of wrap this up, I would say there was a recent study by the Milken Institute that said something like 30% of the households in the Inland Empire have one or more adults who are working remotely. And when you compare that to Los Angeles or Orange County, they're 10 to 15% higher. So there's a lot of people in the Inland Empire who are working at jobs you can't do remotely. You can't do a warehouse work remotely. You can't do retail work remotely. Healthcare workers, a lot of that work, while you can do telemedicine, if you break your leg, that's not a telemedicine visit. That's you got to come into the hospital. So that there are limits on how much we can push teleworking. And I think we will at some point find a happy medium. And I think that happy medium is going to be a hybrid approach.
Yeah, certainly. I definitely agree with that. So kind of switching gears a bit, we have another question from Tom Braun with Proactive Engineering. And he has a question about self-driving trucking and delivery. And so his question is, what is the status of self-driving trucking and delivery and its impact on the employment for truck drivers?
So there are self-driving trucks that are operational now, and they don't make a lot of news, but there are already self-driving trucks going on. And based on my research and research others have done, we believe that there's going to be there has already been and will continue to be a significant amount of investment in self-driving trucks. And I'll give you all an example why. Some of you may be familiar with the comedian Tracy Morgan. Tracy Morgan was involved in a crash where a friend of his was killed. And it was a truck that was being driven by a large retail conglomerate. I won't name them. And I believe there has also been, I've read articles about a looming truck driver shortage. So I believe that we will probably see more self-driving trucks. They're just not going to get the publicity that the Google car or Waymo or others gets. But over the past year, there has been a self-driving truck that regularly drives between Texas and California. And there's a person in the cab, and the person's responsible if there's a mechanical or electronics failure. And that person also backs the truck up to a trailer and drops that trailer off. So I would say it's coming. There have been a number of efforts to deploy autonomous delivery vehicles. I believe that's coming as well. And I think we're on the cusp of seeing some very significant changes in those things happening, because one of the effects of COVID is people are buying more stuff. People are staying at home. There's Instacart. There's all these kinds of things happening. And one way to keep the cost down is to take the human out of it. So I believe in the next 5 years or so, we will see a transition period where there are attended vehicles. So there is a person in the vehicle, but they're not necessarily the driver. So there is a parcel delivery person. I have seen some videos of some parcel delivery robots in urban areas. I did see one get vandalized. So that is why I think it's unlikely we will have unattended vehicles. But if you think about it, if you were to have a self-driving UPS truck, they would need someone in there to deliver the packages. So absolutely yes. Exact timing still something to look at. It was one of the trends. It's another trend I'm watching. It just didn't quite make the list of the top 10, but it is something I'm definitely paying attention to.
Certainly. So before we close out our time, I did want to loop back to the poll that we had going, which was, are you comfortable riding public transit? So we have our responses back, and 73% of respondents said that they are comfortable riding public transit, and 27% said no. So does this shock you at all, Chris, or what are some of your thoughts on it?
No, that's actually a little better than I thought, because I saw a survey that Metrolink did where they surveyed their residents they surveyed their riders at the beginning of COVID, and a third of them said they absolutely will ride Metrolink, a third said they weren't sure, and a third said they were never going to ride Metrolink again. So I would actually say that's good, that's positive. Now, is that truly a representative sample? Probably not, but that is close to what I've seen before, and I think that is, generally a positive number. I will say transit's going to lose riders, unfortunately. And there are some strategies to mitigate that, but I think there's just going to be people who are not comfortable being in a car with other people, in a vehicle with other people, whether they're carpooling, transit, or the like. And I believe that, the transit industry is going to have to be really creative on how they deliver transit services. So I think that's actually a positive number. And, we as transportation planners should be looking for ways to provide transit in a safe, effective and efficient manner. And I'm confident that the people we have working on it for agencies like RTA, Omnitrans, and others in the Inland Empire, we have some really great people. There's some really great people on those staffs, and I'm confident they're up to that challenge. So I'm very much looking forward to it, but not surprised by that number at all.
Certainly. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and start closing out our Q&A portion. But before we do that, Chris, do you have any final remarks before we sign off from this time?
Yeah, I do. I want to tell everyone that the purpose of today's call was to really talk about the trends. And one of the things, there's really two responses to these trends. One is to throw up your hands and say, I can't do anything about it. And the other thing is to say, well, I just don't agree, and this is not the future I want. I read a recent article where there was a quote that said something to the effect of, you either lean into the future or you pass it by. So what I would say is, for each of these trends, local government has some ability to influence them. The state government has a little bit more, the federal government some more influence, but a lot of these things are happening within the private market, and we can't stop many of these trends. We can influence them, we can direct them, but we can't stop them. So I believe that we should really be mindful and keep to that saying and think about what we can do to either lean into it or pass us by, because if we try to fight these trends, then that's not going to be effective. So we should find ways to make these trends work for us. We should try to mitigate some of the negative impacts to the extent we can, but we should be mindful that there's a number of some very strong macroeconomic forces at work, and our ability as local and regional and state government to change them is fairly limited. So, but I also say I'm optimistic for the future. This is COVID gives us an opportunity to reset some of our practices and some of our approaches. And so I don't want to be negative. I am optimistic. I think we have a great future ahead of us in the Inland Empire and Western Riverside County region. And we should just be to work within these trends to get the outcome we want, rather than try to think that we can completely change how the future works.
Certainly. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for sharing your insight today and just for your time. And thank you all who tuned in today for participating in our 10th Future For It episode. I'm going to pass it right back off to Miss Elisa Laurel.
Well, thanks, Chris, and thank you, Rachel. Now, before we sign off, we look forward to seeing you at our next broadcast, which will be in May, since we are operating on a bi-monthly schedule. And the topic for our 11th episode is going to be focused on environment and conservation, where we'll be featuring a dynamic panel of speakers, and it will be moderated by our Director of the Riverside County Habitat Conservation Agency, otherwise known as RCHCA, and our Director, Princess Hester, will be moderating the discussion. So look out for those marketing details, and we look forward to seeing you in May. Bye.